George Lucas sold Lucasfilm to the Walt Disney Company in October of 2012, following years of consideration. On the topic of the sale, Lucas said, "It's now time for me to pass Star Wars on to a new generation of filmmakers." Disney immediately began development on their plans for the sequel trilogy, with Episode 7 slated for 2015. George had written outlines for the sequel films, and handed them off to the creative leads to use, but they decided to go in a different direction, leading to Lucas declining a consulting role on the films. Without Lucas involved, J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, Michael Arndt, Lawrence Kasdan, and Chris Terrio were in charge of writing the sequel trilogy. Not in that order or at that time, but still, you get it. The films released in 2015, 2017, and 2019 to massive financial success and general critical success, but were controversial amongst fans to say the least. There has been a consistent and very clear divide in the Star Wars fandom since the release of the sequels, and in particular, the trilogy's middle film, The Last Jedi. Let's face it, we all know about it. We all have an opinion on it. This film was received so divisively that it broke friendships, divided fan organizations, and, again, let's face it, permanently changed the way that the general public interacts with popular cinema as a whole. This movie did all of that. The discourse around The Last Jedi is prototypical to that found around any popular film that's divisive nowadays for perceived politically partisan reasons. Fans went absolutely nuts on both sides of this film, some lauding it as the saving grace that the franchise needed, the best Star Wars film of all time, or at least since Empire, while others have derided it as the film that destroyed their love for Star Wars and disavow it in all forms. But let's rewind this all, and take a look at the time before The Last Jedi was made, to determine the answer to the question, what if George Lucas made The Last Jedi? A large portion of The Last Jedi tells the story of the budding Jedi student Rey, as she seeks out a jaded and reclusive Master Luke Skywalker for training, finding him at an ancient Jedi Temple island in self-imposed exile after the betrayal of one of his students. As it turns out, this reflects a lot of the ideas that George Lucas himself established for his version of the sequel trilogy. This is abundantly clear in pieces of concept art created and approved by Lucas himself. Like, for example, this bell-shaped temple, illustrated by James Klein, where Luke is in exile, and where a young female student meets him. The other piece that is definitely connected to this story is this haunting depiction of an older Luke Skywalker by Christian Alsman. His glazed-over eyes, long beard, and inward, slumped pose so effectively communicate the feelings of this broken man in self-imposed exile. Alsman described this piece as, Luke was being described as a Colonel Kurtz type, hiding from the world in a cave. Colonel Kurtz was the antagonist of Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece, Apocalypse Now, and was a disgraced U.S. Special Forces operative during the Vietnam War. In the film, reaching Kurtz is the goal of the main characters, as he is hiding in a Cambodian temple, broken by the war he'd been serving in, as his own personal army was barbarically striking against their Viet Cong and northern Vietnamese targets. Making this comparison is fascinating to me, considering that George Lucas was friends with Coppola in real life. That means that this concept art, which was approved by George Lucas, was inspired by Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now. Kurtz is, without a doubt, a violent, broken man, very clearly an antagonist. Lucas knows this. To make the statement of Luke being a Kurtz type is very interesting, if it did indeed come from Lucas himself, which sources say it probably did. Because I'm certain Lucas didn't want to make Luke a villain, but giving him these attributes makes him such a different character. Something very clear in George's ideas for his sequels is that he intended for the young protagonist to be a young woman pursuing Jedi training under this exiled Luke Skywalker, at least in his most recent iterations. This young woman was named Taryn, Kira, Thea, and several other names at different points in development, but you all know her better as Rey. And based on some inferred information from this development period, she may have even been a scavenger, growing up in a junkyard in Lucas's drafts, but this is not firmly known. Kylo Ren is the son of Leia and Han Solo, who is seduced to the dark side, becoming the main villain of the trilogy. As it seems, this concept is something else borrowed from George Lucas's sequel plans. The design for Darth Talon from the Legacy comics was something that stood out to George, for some reason, and he quickly incorporated it into his sequel concept. Working for a more powerful villain codenamed Uber, this Talon-ish character would seduce the son of Han and Leia to the dark side, turning him into a separate concept that was definitely carried over into our sequels, the Jedi Killer. But other than things that we did eventually see in our sequel trilogy, George Lucas has been on record saying so many different things about his sequel trilogy. A wide range of ideas that no doubt changed over time, many of which widely contradict each other. At one point, George said he would have focused on the proliferation of the Imperial Remnant, becoming rebellion-like in their own right against the New Republic. Though, admittedly, we can see bits of the First Order in this, but not as much rebellion-like. George also expressed a big interest in exploring the criminal underground aspect of the galaxy, with Darth Maul returning to unite the crime families and take the Empire's place. In other concepts where the earliest versions of Rey were not present, Luke Skywalker was to reunite Jedi scattered from Order 66, rebuilding the Jedi Order only a few years after Return of the Jedi. Though I'm not sure how that would work considering the actors' ages. Leia was also mentioned to be the chosen one, at least in one of these sequel treatments, but this was never further elaborated on. In some sources, Lucas is even said to have intended for his sequels to take place in a microbiotic world, dealing firsthand with the midichlorians and creatures known as the Wills, the true controllers of the universe who feed off of the Force. With all of this in mind, it's hard to determine what Lucas's version of The Last Jedi would actually be like. What we do know, though, are what ideas in the final film were similar to his, and, interestingly, how Lucas chose to make movies of his own. George Lucas was a very referential filmmaker, and is very well versed in the history of cinema. He combined these vast and prominent yet forward-thinking cinematic influences into the original Star Wars film, with his own modern spin to it all. John Ford's The Searchers. J. Lee Thompson's The Guns of Navarone.
I know how to hit those guns, sir.
Yes?
It's ray shielded, so you'll have to use proton torpedoes.
That's impossible, even for a computer.
But it's not impossible. I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home. They're not much better.
Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress and Yojimbo. Walter Grauman's 633 Squadron. All so present in the very DNA of the original Star Wars film. Knowing this, and being similarly familiar with the world and deep interreferential history of film, Rian Johnson chose to do something very similar. Instead of looking to reference and be inspired by Star Wars itself as a concept with his film, like J.J. Abrams did with episodes 7 and 9, Johnson chose to look further back at the films and filmmakers that influenced George Lucas's work on the series. Johnson held screenings of all of these influences, classic films from the era of cinema Lucas was most reverent to, and I personally think you can see that in The Last Jedi. Johnson has something to say about mythology, ideology, religion, and the very idea of hope, all very mythologically grounded and presented through firm grasping of cinematic influences. This, realistically looking at it, is very much like Lucas's own origins as a filmmaker, both having similar careers before going into the original Star Wars and The Last Jedi. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying Rian Johnson is George Lucas or is his successor or anything. Clearly that's not the case. for anyone. Sorry, Filoni. Lucas far outclasses Johnson in many areas, particularly in visual, mythological storytelling, and broad science fiction and fantasy concepts. After all, Johnson is simply playing in a world that Lucas created. But I also do think that Johnson is very similar to Lucas in his origins, his desire to make subversive films that are incredibly referential of classic cinema. Johnson's filmography absolutely represents this to me, and I don't doubt his abilities as a character writer, something he actually does have on George, whose strength was the larger strokes of a story rather than the minutiae. These kinds of larger strokes being something that I definitely see The Last Jedi lacking in.
The First Order will control all the major systems within weeks.
Show us this, maybe? What does that mean? Who are they fighting? Again, after all this discussion of the fact that Lucas in 1976 and Johnson in 2016 are deeply similar filmmakers who have parallel goals and backgrounds, but are ideologically separated by about 40 years and millions of dollars in backing, we return to the question, what if George Lucas made The Last Jedi? What would it have been like? We know it's inspired by his ideas, and more importantly, the things that inspired his ideas, but what would it have actually been? Here's what I think. The Last Jedi, had it been done by George Lucas, probably would have been very similar in everything that happens on Ahch-To. I can absolutely see Lucas crafting a very similar arc for Luke Skywalker, and especially think he would be keen to establish something similar to the subjective flashbacks we see in the film, which are a clear reference to Kurosawa's Rashomon, though maybe Lucas would have much more nuance surrounding Luke's decision. George's version probably would have been more clear. I also think that the bomber battle from the beginning of the film would have been done by Lucas, but probably distinctly faster and probably with a larger focus on dogfighting and inter-cockpit dialogue, and maybe a more clear goal and things to overcome to reach it. But overall, it does still feel very Lucas, considering the very clear World War II influence. For the rest of the film, however, I'm not sure. I definitely think the scale would have been larger though. It would not have just been a handful of ships versus a handful of other ships. The First Order would have been more ragtag in George's version, striking against a republic that would not have been destroyed, but certainly would have been struggling. And this is the area that Lucas largely would have done his political soapboxing, something our sequels really needed more of, but they didn't have because of public backlash to the prequels. Maybe Maul would have even been there with a sexy Twi'lek touching Kylo Ren for some reason. I don't know. And in the end, I do think that Luke would have died fighting Kylo Ren in George's version as well. In the existing film, it's already a powerful parallel to Obi-Wan in the original Star Wars, distracting the bad guy so the heroes can see his death and be inspired before leaving on the Falcon. And I can definitely see Lucas having something similar in his version. Lucas's version of The Last Jedi would have been bigger. It would be more distinct, and probably take even more risks. It would certainly break the status quo, much more than the film that we received from Rian Johnson. And I know that sounds crazy to say because The Last Jedi is the most different Star Wars movie by far, but I think Lucas's would have been different in some similar ways, but some different ways. But my biggest sneaking suspicion is that George Lucas's version would have been much more similar to Johnson's film than many are willing to let on. Several ideas from the final film were directly from or approved by George, and the film's inspirations come from a similar place, and from a filmmaker with a similar background. But I confess, actually, and my argument seems to fall apart with this, but The Last Jedi might actually be much more similar to the original Star Wars film in so many ways than it is to whatever a changed and possibly jaded Lucas would have made for his version of the sequels post-prequels. Maybe that's why this film is so controversial? It takes a lot of the methods that went into the first film's production, and conceptualization, and a general reverence for Lucas's work and ideas, and comes out just kind of weird. But a beautiful weird. The kind of weird that makes it my favorite, and the kind of weird that places it perfectly in line with the original Star Wars film, less in terms of in-universe or cinematic language, but in terms of being related on a deeper level somehow. I'm not sure. I suppose the true answer to this video's title is that we will never know. We will never know what George Lucas's sequel trilogy was like because it will never be made. But as far as modern Star Wars films go, The Last Jedi is as close to Lucas as we're going to get. Production, writing, filmmaking, and inspiration-wise. And most of all, mythologically. Star Wars is a mythological tale, and the way that The Last Jedi reflects that in so many ways is just clear to me. But it might not be to you. Yes, you're still free to hate it if you want, as long as you've genuinely heard out my ideas and aren't hate-watching this, or trying to take apart this video and turn it into a 3-hour-long Disney shill kind of video. I love The Last Jedi, yes, but I also love Star Wars, and the things that inspired it are so core to our world and the history of cinema that Star Wars really reflects that kind of monoculture that was present in the 70s and disappeared shortly after, maybe because of Star Wars in a way. But gosh darn it, I love The Last Jedi, I love Star Wars, and yes, I love George Lucas, that funky guy who walks behind documentaries in Chicago and eats salad at a mall food court. I love the weird, referential, beautiful, poetic, mythological way that he makes movies. And that's why I love The Last Jedi. Thank you for joining me on this journey. My reading recommendation for this video is The Star Wars Archives from 1999 to 2005, where much of the information about George's sequel concepts came from, and it's also just an incredible book.